So I'm speaking very much on behalf of the Natural Capital Committee and all my colleagues and the Secretariat. And the first point I want to make, and as Dieter has just made, is of course that the culmination of a lot of the discussion and ideas that and the whole debates that have been going on for the last 7 years in the Natural Capital Committee came to really fruition in this 25-year environment plan, where the overarching aim of this, as stated many times, is to leave the environment in a better state than it is at present. And not only that to leave the environment in a better state, but to recognise that the environment itself is incredibly important for many of the societal benefits that we want, we desire, and we utilise on a daily basis. So that the nature itself underpins many things like clean air, clean and plentiful water, thriving plants and wildlife, reduced risk of harm from environmental hazards, enhanced beauty, and mitigation and adaptation to climate change, which Baroness Brown will be speaking about after the break. But also the suggestion, as Dieter made before, that was come through very firmly from Dieter and the economists on the Natural Capital Committee, that we should be using public money to pay for the maintenance enhancement of these public goods because of the benefits they provide to all of us on a daily basis. Nature isn't free. It's not a freely available resource. It's something we really do need to value and properly value it in order to make sure that we conserve it going forwards. So the framework that we came up with, and this was actually right at the beginning when we published a how to do it manual, because people were saying, well, what does this look like on the ground? What is a natural capital framework? And a natural capital framework can be split into 3 parts. The first part are the stocks. So these are the natural capital assets. They're the species, the communities, the landscapes, ecosystems, soils, water, air, all of those things that are part of what we would broadly call nature. But also there's the below ground parts, like the soils, like the geology, etc. Those things, all of that is our natural capital assets. And if we look at the function of the extent, the quality, the spatial configuration of those, they provide these flows, these really important ecosystem services, which the flows. So these are things like pollination, CO2 sequestration, soil erosion protection, water flow regulation, water and air purification, land for recreation, and also really important habitats for biodiversity. So all of those are ecosystem services that are provided by that mixture of stocks. But it's from those, and I remember Georgina Mace making the point really clearly at the beginning, they are only ecosystem services if they have a public good, if they provide a societal benefit. And so all of those ecosystem services can be matched onto societal benefits, public goods. So pollinated crops, 75% of our crops in the world are pollinated. We need pollinators, we need pollination habitats. We're all craving for a more stable climate and to lower atmospheric carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide sequestration leads to those equitable climates. Flood risk protection, clean air, clean water, good physical, mental well-being from being in recreational spaces, and also a thriving wildlife. All of those are those public goods which we should be paying public money to conserve and to enhance. So that's very much the framing of the natural capital, and that framework you will find in our How to Do It manual, which I think we published in 2016, right at the beginning. But when you look at the 25-year environment plan, there are 3 key questions I think we still need to ask, and we're still struggling to ask. And the first one is what stocks are the most important to measure and conserve? We can't measure and conserve everything, and that's always the rule of conservation. When you think about it, what do we want to prioritise when we're conserving natural capital stocks? The second one is, where are the data gaps? Where do we need to fill data gaps, and what have we already got in terms of these? We have got some incredible data sources about nature in the UK, but where are those gaps in there? And the third thing is then, how do we urgently fill these data gaps to ensure that we do have a baseline against which we can measure improvement in the environment over the next 25 years? And I would say, and I hope the rest of the Natural Capital Committee would agree, these are 3 key questions that we've been grappling with over the last couple of years, and very much some of these are coming through in the final report and also in the assessment that came out last week as well. So first of all, let's start with that first question. In a natural capital framework, which stocks are most important to measure? Now, if you look at this flow chart here, I've got on the screen, so take this this basic flow chart. Immediately, I think all of us, myself included, we always start with thinking the stocks, let's measure the stocks, then we'll measure the flows, and then we'll measure the public goods. But this immediately illustrates a problem, because you can measure all the stocks in the world, but actually you really want to be focusing on the stocks that lead to the flows that underpin those ecosystem services and the public goods. So in some ways, you need to be going the other way around. You start with what public goods are we thinking about, and then think what flows do they require, and then think about, well, what stocks underpin those flows. But being very mindful that actually quite a lot of public goods or quite a lot of flows are underpinned by one or two natural capital assets. So that in fact, these, if I had a pointer, that far right-hand end of public goods, you'd find that most public goods can be underpinned by a number of key stocks, and it's really finding those sort of hotspots of stocks that we ought to be looking for. So let me just give you an example, because somebody said to me recently from a government department, well, what does a natural capital asset map look like? What should we actually be measuring? You know, show me what you mean. So I thought, right, okay, let me give you one example here, and I'm going to use this catchment. It's one I know well. There are many other examples, but this is one that I know of the work that's been done here. So within a natural capital framework, if we're thinking about the benefits, then your question here would be, in this catchment, which is north of Oxford, the Evenlow catchment, which natural capital stocks are important to conserve for flood risk protection? So your public good is flood risk protection in here. Now, to work out flood risk protection, this looks more complicated than it needs to be. The sort of usual method is to use these hydrological models called vertical water balance models. And in here, you put in vegetation cover, soil type, topography, geology, slope at a 30-metre resolution. If you look at the far right-hand side, and you cover the whole drainage basin, and from that, for each 30 metres, this model will work out what contribution that little pixel is making towards overland flow. So when you have a storm event, what you end up with is water flowing through. Right, let's move on. So, what's your input look like? Well, input then are your asset maps, and it's asset maps of land cover, topography, soil type, and geology in the Evenlow drainage basin catchment. That's what you use as the input to this model. So you've got your land cover in there, and you've got your soils. Both of those maps, those would be your asset maps that come from publicly available databases. And when you put it through that model, what you end up with, your output map for the Evenlow catchment will be as follows. And the areas that you see in blue on there are blue because of the combination of the land cover, the soil type, and the slope, mean that they are really important in reducing overland flow in a storm event. So therefore, they're holding the water back and not allowing the water to rush into the rivers and flood Oxford, something that's very close to my heart. However, the areas in red behave like bare soil. So the rain will land on that and shoot over the land and go rapidly into the river and cause a flood event. So in the Evenlow catchment then, if you're focusing on the natural capital stocks that are important for flood risk reduction, you'll be looking at those areas in blue. Those are the areas you want to conserve. But let me just make another point here. If you map the Evenlow catchment of areas that are important for biodiversity or a thriving wildlife, and you just look at the difference, the areas in blue on the left and the areas in green on the right, there isn't much overlap. And this is a really important point. We can't use habitat type to underpin or assume it will always be habitat types that we can conserve, and they will provide the necessary assets to also provide benefits for flood risk. So it's a really important point to be made in there, because I think we can quickly go down a habitat route and actually not capture the right information. And that's the point in there. So the advice from the NCC then is that we should be focusing on measuring stocks that underpin important ecosystem services. We should have a systems approach for measuring stocks, so assessments are based not around individual habitat patches, but are capturing a whole basin catchment. But also there is already much data necessary for measuring stocks. And this is the other point, we don't need to start from the beginning again. But the top-down coordination is now urgently needed to address these critical data gaps that I'll come on to in a minute. And so this is the next part, and this is very much came through from the incredible work also that the Natural Capital Committee Secretariat have done over the last 8 months to say, where are the greatest data gaps in our current knowledge on UK natural capital stocks? Because anyone that's worked on data from the UK knows there are some incredible data resources, and a lot of this has been collected by the government departments over many, many years, and we must use that rather than starting again from the beginning. But what we found in our report is there's 4 critical data gaps that we identified. There are data gaps in terms of spatial coverage, temporal coverage, determining conditioning of stock, and data accessibility. And I'll give you some examples now in the following slides. So the first one is significant spatial data gaps, and the example I'm going to give is in the quality of our air. So our best air quality network is the automatic urban and rural network, and you can see that on the left hand slide in the green. And we've got currently 170 automatic air quality monitoring stations that basically do real-time monitoring of quality of air. So a really incredible resource in there. But just eyeballing that, you can see there are large gaps. There's large gaps in rural areas in particular. And I think it's this is one area where we need to think about where and how can we fill those gaps to ensure that we have full spatial coverage of England, not these big patches where we know what's going on in the cities, but we have no idea what's going on in the urban or the peri-urban areas. If you look at the one on the right, this is airborne particulate matter. In fact, there's only 4 stations routinely monitoring the UK airborne particulate matter, although I suspect some are covered by the green. But the point is still in there. We have got these significant spatial data gaps. The second one is gaps in temporal coverage. If we want to measure the trends in whether or not something's getting better or worse and model what's happening to the flows, we need to have regular intervals in time, hopefully every couple of months or even every year, in order to be able to do this. If you look at this, these are our major stocks of species, communities and landscapes. We've got soils, it's the Cranfield soil maps, those are pretty consistent. Land cover maps, fantastic land cover maps come out from CEH, but they come out every couple of years. The last time we routinely surveyed the hedgerow data in a publicly available resource was in 2007. The National Tree Map was the last time we resourced and looked at our national tree coverage, it was 2017. Protected areas, 2020 is the most recent one, and you look at the surface water classification from the this is the Water Framework Directive. You'll see there are 2 cycles in there. We're now behind on that, and peatlands was in 2010. We can't make a proper assessment of the trends if we don't have regular data in there, and this is a big problem. And we flagged this up in the report. Another one is actually in the condition of the UK's natural capital stocks. Many of them we simply don't measure the condition, and I don't want to get at the Water Framework Directive because at least we are measuring the conditions in there, and this is going to continue when we exit Brexit. However, we can't assume that the Water Framework Directive is able to do everything, and in fact, small rivers and small lakes are not covered. So if you just look at the Eastern England here, those networks in green are those that have been assessed, and those in purple are not assessed. We have no idea of the condition of those lakes and wetlands and rivers that are in purple. So how much does this account for? Well, if we look at this, in the 6 counties of East England, of the lakes, only 18% are assessed for quality, and 71% of the rivers. And in England, 12% of the lakes overall are assessed, and the small water bodies, and 77% of the rivers. Very, very small numbers of the lakes and wetlands. Yet in terms of biodiversity, these possibly are some of our most important reservoirs. The last point is the accessibility of some of UK's key data on stocks. We talk about open source. I remember very clearly when I started at Kew and also started on the Natural Capital Committee being told that the data on stocks would be open source. 7 years on, the ones in brown, so the soils, the land cover maps, the hedgerow data and the national tree map are not open source. They are behind a paywall. The ones in blue, so the National Forest Inventory, Protected Area Surface Water Classification, are open source. Does it matter that we have these ones behind a paywall and people can't afford to begin them? Well, let me just go back to the even load catchment. If I use the open source data to map the soils, that is what you get. If I use the payment for use version, which is the soilscape data from Cranfield, that's what you get. You get a huge difference in the model output depending on whether or not you use the open source or the payment for use. And this is a really critical point that needs to be tackled at a national level, I think now, about these national databases and who is going to fund them. So just to conclude on that section then, there is inconsistent spatial coverage. The temporal coverage is extremely patchy. The determining of conditions of stocks is highly variable, and data accessibility is poor for some of the UK's key environmental data sets. So what can we do about it? I don't want to end on a low note. I think all of us, our worry cup is probably well and truly overfull, but I think there are ways around this one. And I do want to now finish in the last 5 minutes by talking about our ideas about a natural capital baseline. And this will very much hopefully feed on through to some of the discussions that go on this afternoon. What should we be measuring and where? And how? This is the really key thing I want to come on to here. And I want to actually come back to this man, Dudley Stamp, who was born he lived between 1898 and 1966. He was a prominent British geographer and studied at King's College in London. And he directed the publication of the Land Utilisation Survey of Britain. And a lot of the current government policy on land use control in Britain can be traced back to this survey. So this was a baseline survey, but how did he do it? Well, he did it this way. He surveyed the whole of the country, but using volunteers, citizen scientists, colleagues, students, school teachers and pupils to a scale of 6 inches to a mile. And the publication of the maps began in 1933 and was completed in 1948. What did they look like? Well, everyone went out literally with colouring pencils, and they coloured in the yellow is moorland and heath, light green is grassland, dark green woodland, brown arable, etc. That is the map. And you'll see this is Cockermouth up in the Lake District. A lot of the area there was yellow moorland and heath. Now, one of the reasons for doing this was to say, where should we be planting more trees? So therefore, that was a sole sort of one of the key aims of what they set out. And therefore, they were trying to look at what the woodland cover was like. So how much change has gone on then since Dudley Stamp? This is the 1930 land cover map, and we converted it using satellite. We converted it so it's comparable to the CEH land cover map of 2015. And what you'll see in here is this was London in 1930, and the green in there are the trees. And this is London now, and you'll see large increase not only in urban areas, but also large increase in forest cover. This is Thetford in 1930. Thetford Forest, note the name. This is Thetford presently. Large increase in urban areas, large increase in forest cover. In fact, if you look at what's happened to the forest cover in the UK since the 1940s, you'll see there's been a really large increase that's gone on. So what lessons can we learn then from this 1930s policy? Well, first of all, they undertook a baseline census at the beginning of the process to determine current state. There was a single clear policy objective to restore UK forests. They had a top-down approach in terms of vision. It was delivered by a number of bodies, government bodies, but centrally coordinated by one body, in this case the Forestry Commission. And then they made subsequent measures of UK forests at the same spatial scale over subsequent years to assess progress and determine trends. So just really to conclude then, I think this whole approach is where we've been talking and really trying to advise the government, in that we strongly recommend the government adopts a similar approach to developing a natural capital environmental census. And the single aim is to develop a clear natural capital baseline of the UK stocks. You need approaches which can be repeated in subsequent years to establish trends over time. And it's only by doing this that we'll be able to properly determine trends in the UK's natural capital stocks, and then the flows from that, and our progress towards leaving the environment in a better state in 25 years' time. Thank you.